Dr. McLatchie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor to be here.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your time. Tell us a little bit about your family, your location, your domicile, your credentials, and so forth.
Sure. So I grew up in Scotland. My family is in Scotland. I was raised there. I did my degrees in the field of biology. I have a bachelor's degree in forensic biology from the University of Strathclyde. I also have a master's in evolutionary biology from the University of Glasgow and another master's in medical and molecular bioscience from Newcastle University. And then I completed my PhD in early 2020, which is in studying the evolution of the eukaryotic cell cycle. And currently, I'm an assistant professor of biology at a Christian college in Boston, Massachusetts, called Sattler College. I'm also a fellow of the Discovery Institute, Center for Science and Culture in Seattle, Washington. And I've been living in the United States for 3 years. I'm married with my wife, Katerina. We got married in 2019. She is from Austria. And we currently live in the United States. And I've been really enjoying our time here.
You're well trained in the field of those particular sciences. So I guess I asked the right guy on here for couple of questions I have. So we'll get right to it. In the field of science, and in this discussion between, faith and science, or science and the Bible, you get these questions or challenges from folks a lot about, the design in the universe and origins. It all goes back to naturalism. Naturalism is the answer. And also, along with that, most people think that scientists in toto believe in naturalism as the explanation for origins of the universe. Can you begin to answer that?
Well, first of all, that's just not true. I mean, there are many biologists and scientists who subscribe to intelligent design, or think that there's a creator behind the universe. There's, for example, the scientific descent from Darwinism list, which is signed by over 1,000 scientists, including myself, who have expressed reservations about the strengths or the merits of neo-Darwinian orthodoxy. And there's a number of reasons why I and many other scientists think that biology and the natural sciences more broadly points quite forcefully to the conclusion of design. For example, the information content of the cell, since particularly the 1950s, we've understood the information basis of life. And we've understood that along the spine, or what biologists call the sugar phosphate backbone of the DNA molecule, are chemical subunits that we represent with the alphabetic characters of A, C, T, and G, which determines the sequential arrangement of amino acids, which are the subunits of proteins that fulfill many of the jobs in the cell, such as catalyzing reactions and being contributing to macromolecular machines. And in every realm of experience of cause and effect, when we're dealing with information content, particularly in a digital form, we habitually associate that with conscious, deliberative activity. And so when we find information content in the cell, it's not particularly surprising that we'd find that we'd make that observation, given the hypothesis that a mind was involved in life's origins. But it's wildly surprising on the falsity of that hypothesis. And so that tends to favor, I think, quite overwhelmingly, the design hypothesis. And then you look at irreducible complex machinery that we find in the cell. So irreducible complexity is a term that was coined by biochemist Michael Behe from Lehigh University in Pennsylvania in his book Darwin's Black Box in 1996. And basically, the idea is that there are many thousands of systems in biology where there's a higher level objective that's being accomplished by multiple subfunctions that have to work together in unison to bring about that higher level objective. And so if you were to take one of the subfunctions away, you wouldn't have a system that worked half as efficiently as it used to, or a quarter as efficiently as it used to, but would be broken. And so an example from everyday usage would be a mousetrap, where you've got the platform, you've got the spring, you've got the hold down bar, you've got the catch, you've got the staples that hold the trap together. And if any of those pieces were missing, you wouldn't have a trap that worked half as efficiently as it used to, or caught a quarter as many mice as it used to, but it would be broken. And there are many such examples like that in biology. And the reason that this contributes to the case for design is because intelligent agents uniquely have the ability to visualize a complex end goal and then bring everything together needed to realize that end goal, whereas mindless, unguided stochastic processes typically can't do that. And so the irreducible complex systems of biology, of which there are many thousands, point, I think, quite forcefully to the conclusion that a mind was involved in life's origins. So an example of an irreducible complex system in biology would be the DNA replication apparatus. So there are various components that are involved. There's the initiation proteins that open up the DNA double helix, prepare for copying, and then you've got the helicase enzyme that breaks the hydrogen bonds between the two strands of the DNA to prepare for copying. You've got the DNA polymerase that actually performs the copying. You've got the primase enzyme, because the DNA polymerase isn't able to begin replication by itself. It needs what's called a 3' hydroxyl group in order to start. And so there's an enzyme called primase, which synthesizes a short RNA sequence at the start of the strand to allow the DNA polymerase to take over. You have the sliding clamp that clamps on the polymerase to the strand of DNA to prevent it from falling off during copying. You have the clamp loader that loads on the sliding clamp. You have the topoisomerase enzymes that alleviate supercoiling, because as the DNA unwinds, it can result in torsional, because of the torsional stress that can result in supercoiling. Think of an old telephone cord getting supercoiled. And so the topoisomerase enzyme basically is able to cut one of the strands, pass the other strand through the break, and then reseal the break to alleviate that supercoiling. Because of the antiparallel nature of DNA, the two strands have to be copied in opposite directions. One strand has to be copied backwards, and so the strands actually gets looped around and copied discontinuously. Basically, there are short RNA primers that are laid down, and then very short Okazaki fragments, which are just short segments of DNA that are copied from those RNA primers. Basically, the RNA primers have to get removed and replaced with DNA. The Okazaki fragments have to get glued together. There's an enzyme for doing that called ligase. And so forth. And if any of those components were missing, then you wouldn't have DNA replication that worked half as efficiently as it used to, or quarter as efficiently as it used to, but it would be broken. And so how do you, by numerous successive slight modifications, put together a system like that without knowing where the target is? And furthermore, I cherry-picked that particular example because that's an example of what I would call irreducible complexity on steroids, because it's the natural selection presupposes differential survival. You cannot have natural selection unless you have differential survival, which of course depends upon self-replicatability. And so you can't really invoke natural selection to explain the existence of self-replicatability without assuming the existence of everything you're trying to explain. So that's just one example of many. And then you've also got evidences in the physical sciences as well for design, such as the fact the universe seems, as far as we can tell, to have had a beginning, something like 13.8 billion years ago. And there's overwhelming evidence for that. For example, the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy, indicates that entropy tends to increase in the universe. Entropy is a measurement of disorderliness in the universe. And so the implication is that if the universe is left to itself, it will eventually result in a heat death, where there's no usable energy left in the universe to perform work, and everything will be at absolute zero temperature, which is minus 273 degrees centigrade. And if the universe were eternal, we'd have already arrived at that heat death, but we haven't. And so that indicates that the universe is finite, and just one of many evidences for that conclusion. Okay. And in fact, the universe seems to have had a beginning. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish that thought.
The fact the universe seems to have had a beginning is more probable on the supposition of theism than it is on the supposition of atheism.
Okay. I want to certainly get to that probabilistic issue, but let me back up. So what you said thus far with these subfunctions within the cell, these things, then it's fairly impossible that they happen by chance random processes, right?
Yeah, so the argument isn't that they happen by chance per se. They have so chance, of course, is an important contributor, but there's also a non-random element to evolution, which is natural selection. So natural selection ensures that the organisms that are most conducive to survival in their environments survive, and so the combinations of gene variants that they possess tend to increase in frequency over time in the population, whereas the combinations of gene variants that are less conducive to survival tend to become less frequent over time. So there's a non-random element to evolution. But when we're talking about irreducible complex systems, you have to appeal to a lot of chance in order for natural selection to really take effect, because natural selection can't visualize a complex end goal, because natural selection is great at ensuring the survival of the fittest, but not great at ensuring the arrival of the fittest. And so to get to the arrival of the fittest, you need to appeal to a lot of chance. And it seems that when multiple codependent changes are required in order to bring about a fitness benefit that can be acted on by natural selection, that's where random processes really fail in explaining what we need to explain.
Okay. So we're joined today by Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, and he is a biology professor in Boston. And we're talking science and faith and whatever his subfields are in apologetics, because Dr. McLatchie, as I know, can debate and discuss these issues from a wide variety of fields of study. Back to the thing, though, that you said about from the physical universe and what were you talking about? Second law of thermodynamics and so forth. Why is it, though, that notwithstanding that those things are true, why is it, do you think, so many, especially in the science world, still hold to Darwinian naturalism, evolutionary biology, and so forth? Why do you think they still hold to those things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't like to speak for everyone in the fields, because I think that there's a wide diversity of reasons that people might have. I think so. My sense is, first of all, a lot of people in the biological community are not very knowledgeable of evolution. If you talk to your everyday biologist working in the lab, they're working on a very small problem. They don't give a lot of thought to evolution, and it's just not their area of expertise. So the vast majority of working biologists, I think, are not very knowledgeable on evolution beyond perhaps the basics. And then of the minority of biologists who actually do specialize in evolution, namely evolutionary biologists, the vast majority of them are not familiar with the criticisms of neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. And so, and then of the very small minority of those specialists who are familiar with those criticisms, their rejoinders to the arguments are not very good. So I take the consensus there with a large grain of salt. And I do think that there is, for many, I'm not saying this is the case for all, but for many, there is a naturalistic bias that colors their judgment when it comes to these matters. For example, there's the famous quote by Richard Lewontin, who said that we cannot allow a divine foot in the door, and so we should a priori rule out supernatural causes.
These your responses, and you're educating us today and talking about these things from your field of science. They take my mind. Since I'm a Bible professor, they take my mind to Psalm 19. The heavens are declaring the glory of God, but that's out there, that's astronomical, if you will. But you're saying also at the molecular level, way down here, you also find evidence for design.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Paul, the apostle, would feel extremely vindicated when, in the first century, when he wrote Romans 1, verse 20, that through the created order, through things that have been made, God's eternal attributes and divine nature are being clearly perceived, such that men are anapologetes, that they're without an apologetic, they're without an excuse. That I think that he would feel very vindicated by our modern advances in the physical and life sciences, which really, I think, puts the question of whether there's a God or not beyond question. I think the evidence is just absolutely staggering. And this also, of course, relates to the problem of divine hiddenness, which I get asked about quite a bit, which is the idea, why doesn't God make himself more obvious? And I think, at least if theism is construed in the broad sense, I think that theism is obvious. I think that, unfortunately, it's made artificially difficult by bad scholarship. People asking, why do we need to get PhDs in astrophysics and molecular biology to see if there's a God? Well, you don't. It's just that the bad scholarship that gets in the way is technical, and so it needs a technical response. But the actual inference that we can make from looking at living organisms and so forth for design is not a difficult inference to draw. And so I think that that given that it's non-obvious that there's nothing to the Christian claim because of the evidence of God in nature, I think that renders it's incumbent upon one to investigate the evidences for Christianity. And I'm confident that when one does that and tries to do so objectively and impartially, one will, at least in the long run, come to find Christianity to be true and well supported.
Very good. And also, and this is again, we're talking science and faith, or faith in the Bible and so forth. We're joined by biologist Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. So those of us in the apologetics world are used to this term fine tuning, again, to refer to things out there, but you also use that term at the molecular level. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. One example of that would be the fine tuning of the genetic code. So the genetic code is the mapping, if you will, between codons, which are basically 3-letter words in the language of DNA, each of which specifies an amino acid, which is a subunit of proteins. There's 64 different codons and there's 20 amino acids. So there's a redundancy in the genetic code. The amino acids are coded for by multiple codons, and there's multiple levels of fine tuning of the genetic code, which tend to point to design. One of those, for example, is that the genetic code seems to be set up in such a way that codons that differ by only one letter or one base either end up specifying the same amino acid or an amino acid with similar chemical properties. And so it mitigates against the effects of frame shift. It mitigates against the effect of substitutionary mutations. And that's interesting because to get you cannot really get a substantially evolving genetic code, because to do so, if you were to change the codon to amino acid mapping of over time, then you would essentially be modifying every polypeptide produced by the cell, which would wreak havoc. And so this is why Francis Crick referred to the genetic code as a frozen accident, because you cannot really evolve the genetic code once it's already been established. And so the fine tuning of the genetic code, I mean, the fact that there are language conventions at all is far less surprising on the design hypothesis and on the naturalistic hypothesis. And the fact that it's fine-tuned is, again, far less surprising if you are a design theorist than it is if you're not a design theorist. And so it confirms the design hypothesis.
Okay, thank you. And you have another unique illustration, if you can share on evidential, the notion of evidence is it's coming upon a cabin in the forest.
This illustration I actually got from Dr. Timothy McGrew, who's a philosopher at Western Michigan University. But this is one I sometimes use in order to illustrate the concept of evidence, what we mean by evidence. So you suppose that you come across a cabin in the forest and you're far away from roads and sidewalks and civilization and so forth, and you come across this cabin and it looks like it's run down. It doesn't look like there's anyone inhabiting the cabin. And so you decide to inspect. And so you prise open the door and you see a tumbler sitting on the table. And inside this tumbler is Earl Grey tea, which is still steeping. It's not at room temperature. And now, on the hypothesis that the cabin is inhabited, would you have predicted that you would find a cup of Earl Grey tea that's still steeping? Well, no, not particularly. There's all kinds of things that you might have found. You might have found coffee or a different type of tea, or there might have been nothing there and it could still have been inhabited. So it's not highly predicted given that hypothesis, but it's still far better predicted given the hypothesis the cabin's inhabited than it would have been on the falsity, because it's not especially surprising if the cabin's inhabited that you would find that, but it's wildly surprising if the cabin's not inhabited. And so again, it tends to confirm the inhabitation hypothesis. So I'm a card-carrying Bayesian when it comes to epistemology, and so that's the way that we can see of evidence as Bayesians is again in terms of a likelihood ratio. The probability. So on the numerator, you have the probability of the evidence existing given the hypothesis being true, and on the denominator, you have the probability of that same evidence existing given the hypothesis is false. And the extent to which that likelihood ratio is top-heavy, that's the extent to which you have evidence for your hypothesis.
Okay, and this is part and parcel, I think, because you've crossed from scientific apologetics into philosophical apologetics, perhaps, but you can do that. I happen to know that you're capable of doing that. You debate around the world. I've seen in one particular episode where you presented a defense of the existence of God based on the probability argument, and I think what you've just said is part and parcel of that. But can you elaborate a little more on the probability notion that you use?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, there's the fact the universe seems, as far as we can tell, to have had a beginning. There's several lines of evidence that tend to confirm that, and that observation is less surprising if theism is true than it is if atheism is true, right? If the steady state model, which was a dominant model prior to the Big Bang cosmology in the 20th century, if that had turned out to be correct, then that would have been appropriately taken by atheists as evidence against theism, because it sits far more comfortably on an atheistic view than it does on a theistic view. And so the converse then is necessarily true. The fact that the steady state model, which it maintains a static universe, an eternal universe that's been here forever, the fact that that turned out to be false and the universe hasn't been here forever tends to favor the theistic hypothesis. Now, there's a very common mistake that people make on both sides, both the atheist and the theist, which is to think that if an argument can't sufficiently justify a conclusion, then it doesn't count for any evidence. And I think that unfortunately this problem is, or this misconception is fueled by approaches to apologetics as taken by some like William Lane Craig, for instance, where they will present all of their arguments in terms of deductive syllogism. So the cosmological argument, for instance, everything which begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. And then the fine-tuning argument he also presents deductively as well. But I think that evidence can still carry evidential value, even if it's not sufficient to justify the conclusion. So my expression of the cosmological argument would be far more modest than that of William Lane Craig. So I'm not arguing that the fact the universe has a beginning justifies theistic belief. I'm saying that it confirms theistic belief, meaning that it makes theistic belief more plausible than it was previously. And then you also factor in the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of our universe. So, for instance, the cosmological constant, which determines how rapidly the universe expands, is thought by physicists to be finely tuned. The usual value that's given in the literature is 10 to the 120th power. I think the most conservative value that's given in the literature is 1 in 10 to the 53rd power. But in any case, it's very, very exquisitely fine-tuned. And so if the cosmological constant were to vary by so much as a hair's breadth, then either the universe would expand so rapidly that you'd only ever get the two lightest elements, hydrogen and helium, or you get a big crunch scenario. Either way, no life could exist. You've also got the gravitational constant, the ratio of the strong weak nuclear force, and so forth. There's a whole range of different parameters and constants have to be finely tuned for life to exist. Now, again, that observation is not particularly surprising if theism is true, but it's wildly surprising on the falsity thereof. Right. And one might say, well, perhaps there could be some other explanation. Perhaps it's a multiverse, and we just got lucky in this cosmic lottery or something like that. And I would say to that, well, sure, there's some problems with the multiverse hypothesis that we could discuss, but let's just say that's possible for the sake of argument. But it does render theism more plausible than it was previously, and therefore it contributes to an evidential case. And when we have two explanations that can explain the same data, we want to look for more data, right, to help us to differentiate between those two alternative hypotheses. And so then you would also factor in the biological evidence of design, which again adds further weight to the theistic case. And you've also got other categories of fine tuning besides the physical laws and constants. So Michael Denton, for example, has a series of books. His most recent one is called The Miracle of Men, but he's also written other books like The Wonder of Water and the and Children of Light and so forth. And he points out various instances where nature seems to be fine-tuned or seems to be a conspiracy so as to be conducive to human existence. So, for instance, he points out that there's various properties of water which are highly fine-tuned to make life possible. For example, water is unique in that because of hydrogen bonding, when it freezes, it expands, which makes it actually float rather than sink when it freezes. We call it ice. When water freezes, it insulates the water beneath and keeps it in its liquid form. But if the ice were to sink to the bottom, then the oceans would freeze from the bottom up. And much of the planet would be permanently encased in ice, which obviously would not be great. There's also other levels of fine-tuning associated with water. For example, it's the intrinsic properties of water allow the hydrologic cycle, so the water can be transported onto the land where it's required. Water, uniquely at the ambient temperatures at the Earth's surface, is able to exist in all three states of solids, liquid, and gas. And so that allows the hydrologic cycle where water evaporates into the atmosphere and then comes down as rain. And water, of course, didn't owe us those properties, and yet it's there. Otherwise, much of the world would be a barren desert. You've also got the high evaporative cooling of water, so that when we sweat, we can actually, because if the temperature is like 38 degrees centigrade, then the environment outside of us is actually warmer than our core body temperature. So we can't just radiate the heat out in order to cool down on a hot summer's day. But we sweat instead, and because of the high evaporative cooling of water, that allows us to cool down. And it's just on and on. There's various properties that seem to be highly fine-tuned for life to exist. And that's just the pinnacle of the iceberg. There's also the properties of light. So, for example, there's a very, very small band in the electromagnetic spectrum, which is visible light. That is light which is conducive to photochemistry. Very, very small band. You can think of it as perhaps a few playing cards in a stack of cards stretching all the way to the Andromeda Galaxy. Right, that's how small the band is that's conducive to photochemistry, so that we could see, and so the photosynthesis can take place. And then you've also got a very narrow band as well, which is the near infrared, which is felt as heat. And it's interesting then that more than half of the radiation emitted by the sun just so happens to fall in that range, that very, very narrow range. The light, which is conducive to the radiation that's conducive to photochemistry, and the adjacent near infrared, which is felt as heat. And it also just so happens that the atmosphere allows in those sorts of radiation and blocks out the harmful rays, like the microwaves and gamma rays and so forth, which are harmful to living organisms such as ourselves. And so when you look at all of those different properties of our universe, everything just seems to be a conspiracy to make life possible. And so even if each of these individual lines of evidence is not sufficient, only suggestive on its own, when you take all of those different lines of evidences in aggregate, it seems to me to render the case for theism essentially beyond question.
Okay, and you would include the arguments taken in aggregate. You would include for instance, 5 ways to know how God exists. You would include all of that as well, because none of those probably are sufficient in and of themselves, right, to present a solid case.
You mean Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways?
Yeah. Well, just cosmological view, fine-tuning, and then the actual molecular and astronomical evidence. You're saying taking all of those together, you have a very strong case that the theistic God exists.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly.
What about, and thank you. And again, we're with biology professor, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. Thank you for coming on the Bible Professor Show. But let me give you a little pushback here, because some people will say, okay, So you've given all of this is actually an excellent presentation, by the way, of all these examples from the scientific community, from the science world of science, about a designer exists. And some people say, okay, you've got us to, there's a great designer, probably, but take us across that line. How do you get from there's a theistic God or a great designer to the God of Christianity, the God of the Bible? Take us across that line.
Yeah, so there's a number of, I've got about 6 or 7 different lines of argument for Christianity specifically. Obviously, don't have time to do justice to all of those, but let's talk about perhaps one or two if we have time. So let's talk first of all about the resurrection. Let's talk about the resurrection of Jesus. So the approach that I would take to the resurrection of Jesus is what I call the maximal data approach to the resurrection. And basically the argument in its skeletal form, if you will, or as a summary form, would take the following form. It would argue that we have very, very strong reason to think that the accounts that we find in the Gospels and Acts concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters actually reflects the unembellished statements of those who were purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And if that's the case, then one of 3 things is true, as indeed is the case when we're evaluating any sort of testimonial claim, whether we're talking about a sexual assault allegation or witness to a miracle or whatever it happens to be. Namely, the witnesses lied, or they were honestly mistaken, or they were telling us the truth. And when you look at the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters that we find in the Gospels and Acts, we find that the statements that are made there are not the sort about which it's easy to be honestly mistaken. They don't involve merely individual sightings from a great distance and very briefly or something like that, but rather they involve group sightings of Jesus. Not only that, but group conversations with Jesus, long extended discourses with Jesus, like the Emmaus disciples in Luke 24, for example. They involve physical contact with Jesus. They involve watching Jesus eat broiled fish in Luke 24, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. They are, according to Acts 1, it's extended across a 40-day time period, right? So it's not just a brief and confusing episode. And so it's a sort of set of testimonial claims about which it's not easy to be honestly mistaken. I mean, think back to a time, perhaps when you were in high school and you were hanging out with a friend that you used to hang out with in high school. Do you think you could testify to 2 things? Namely, this was in fact your friend and not someone else. And number 2, that your friend was in fact alive and not dead. Well, of course, it's very difficult to be honest and mistaken about that, right? So that's one argument against them being honestly mistaken. There's another argument, though, as well, which further bolsters that case. So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul refers to Christ as the first fruits from among those who have fallen asleep. And what he means by that is that Christ is the fulfillment of the first fruits feast, which in the same way that the first fruits represents the first fruits of the harvest, the guarantor, if you will, that the rest of the harvest is to come. So likewise, Christ is the first to be raised to glory and immortality. He's the guarantor of the general resurrection to come, as per Daniel 12. And
right.
And of course, the first fruits feast is instituted in Leviticus 23. And we read in Leviticus 23 that the first fruits feast is to be commemorated on the day following the first Sabbath, following the Passover, which would make it the Sunday following Passover. Of course, that's the day in which Jesus rose from the dead, according to all 4 Gospels. And it's striking that the early church uniformly and without any competing tradition changed their sacred day from the Sabbath to what they call the Lord's Day, which is the first day of the week. You find that throughout the church fathers. And the reason that's consistently given by all the church fathers is they commemorate the Lord's Day, and they gather in the Lord's Day, they break bread in the Lord's Day, because that's the day when Jesus rose from the dead. You can trace that back to the New Testament even, Book of Revelation, for example, John says, I was in the Spirit in the Lord's day. He doesn't even tell his readers what he means about the Lord's day. It's taken for granted that people know what the Lord's day is. Also, Paul speaks about gathering collection on the first day of the week. In the book of Acts, they're breaking bread on the first day of the week. So, and there's no competing alternative tradition. So that suggests that the idea that Christ rose on the first day of the week goes back exceedingly early. That being the case, that tends to point to design, right? It points to design, and then the question becomes, okay, what's the locus of the design? Is it the case that God supernaturally rose Jesus from the dead on that day in order to fulfill the first fruit symbolism, or is it that the human authors changed the story to make Jesus rise from the dead on the day of first fruits because of theological import? Either way, it points away from the honest mistaken hypothesis again. So having shown how implausible the honest mistaken hypothesis is, then we turn to the two remaining explanations, namely Jesus rose from the dead or the disciples lied. And when we look at the circumstances into which Christianity was birthed, deriving our information from the book of Acts and the letters of Paul and Clement of Rome and other sources, we find that the early apostles there's this context of persecution where the early apostles were willing to endure and undergo sufferings and labors and dangers and hardships and persecutions, in some cases martyrdom, on account of their testimony that Christ was raised from the dead. And multi-party conspiracies, when life or liberty are at stake, have a tendency to break down. And so that goes a long way towards establishing that they were at least sincere in making this statement. Now, notice I'm trying to be careful to nuance my words here, because there's, unfortunately, in some apologetic circles, a tendency to overstate this argument. I'm not saying, as many people say, that all of the apostles except John went to their death as martyrs. We don't have sufficient justification for thinking that to be the case. Right. What I am saying, though, is so that there is a pretty good case for Paul. There's a good case for Peter, for James, the son of Zebedee, for James, the brother of Jesus. Besides that, we really don't know what happened to the apostles. But what we can say is that the apostles took tremendous risks in their statements concerning the resurrection, in the proclamation of the truth of the gospel. And so that goes a long way towards establishing their sincerity, because there was a risk of persecution, imprisonment, and death. We see in the book of Acts, for example, the imprisonment of Peter and John, the stoning of Stephen. And of course, if the apostles were leaders
it's the same with the establishment. It's the same with the establishment of the canon, not too awful long after that, when persecution and death is at stake. They wanted to be sure they had the right books that they were defending to the death.
Right. Yeah. So that's the argument from the persecution. And then you've also got other arguments which further bolster the conclusion that they're not lying. So, for instance, the fact that in all four Gospels, the evangelists use women as the chief discoverers of the empty tomb. Mm-hmm. And as you know, in the patriarchal society that was ancient Israel, the testimony of a woman was worth only a fraction of that of a male witness. And so if you're making stuff up, then why would you have women as the chief discoverers of the empty tomb rather than male witnesses? In fact, that would be ridiculed later. So, and then furthermore, even that point aside, why even involve the women at all? You're involving additional conspirators who are subject to outside influences that are beyond the apostles' control, such as, in the case of the women, their own husbands or perhaps their fathers and other authority figures in their life that could dissuade them from continuing in this conspiracy. So there's a lot of factors that seem to contribute to making a robust case against those two competing explanations, namely that the apostles were honest and mistaken, or that they were lying. And so then the best explanation is that Jesus in fact rose from the dead. Now, of course, the crucial aspect of that case then becomes whether the statements we have in the Gospels and Acts actually do reflect the unembellished testimony of the apostles. And of course, we have to make a case for that. Let me just give you a few examples. This is what I call an evidence sampler. I could talk for many, many hours giving evidence for this premise. Then let me just give you a few examples real quick. So the book of Acts, for example, is written by, and we can show overwhelming evidence to establish this, a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. This is his own claim. In Acts 16 and following, you have the introduction of the we passages, where the author seems to be claiming to be present during the Apostle Paul's journeys. And at one point that Craig Keener makes, which I think is valid, is that in Acts 16, the we passages actually trail off when Paul goes to Philippi. And then you don't see any more we passages until chapter 20, when Paul goes back through Philippi, which suggests that the author had remained in Philippi and had rejoined Paul on his missionary travels when Paul returned through Philippi. And so that suggests that the we passages ought to be taken at face value, that there's not some sort of fancy literary device, as some scholars would maintain, like Victor Perabo and others. But it's actually to be taken at face value. Furthermore, there are numerous, scores and scores of undesigned coincidences that indicate that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. So an example of this is if we go over to the book of 1 Corinthians in chapter 4. Now, 1 Corinthians, of course, was written from Ephesus in Asia Minor, something like AD 53 AD. And he's writing to the church in Corinth, which is the capital of Achaia, what we now know as what we now call Greece. And in verse 17 of 1 Corinthians 4, he says, "That is why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ, as I teach them everywhere in every church." So evidently, at the time of his writing from Ephesus to Corinth, he's already sent Timothy on his way from Ephesus to Corinth. However, when you get to chapter 16 and verse 10, it says, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he's doing the work of the Lord as I am." Now, even though he's already sent Timothy on his way from Ephesus to Corinth, he nonetheless expects his letter to arrive in Corinth before Timothy gets there. That's why he uses the future tense in chapter 16, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you."
Right.
Now, so we'd predict then that the most obvious way to send a letter in those days from Ephesus to Corinth would be over the Aegean Sea, because they're essentially across the Aegean Sea from one another. That would be the most obvious way to send a letter. And we'd infer then that Timothy must have taken the indirect overland route going up through Troas and Macedonia. That's how you would make sense of those very subtle and casual clues in 1 Corinthians. Now, when you turn over to Acts 19, in verse 21 and 22, this is when they were in Ephesus, it says, "After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia," that's where Corinth is, "and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." So he remains behind in Ephesus, and he sends Timothy and Erastus up through Macedonia, exactly as you would predict, given those clues in 1 Corinthians. But notice that Acts doesn't even mention Corinth as their destination. It's very, very casual and artless. Now, when you go to chapter 20, though, we read, "After the uproar ceased," this is from verse 1, "Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months," that's actually when he wrote Romans, "and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, and he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy." So Timothy, in fact, did make it to Corinth, exactly as you would predict from those clues. But notice just how indirect that connection is. Furthermore, it gets even better. Notice who Timothy's traveling companion is up through Macedonia. It's Erastus. Who's Erastus? Well, Romans 16 tells us, because Romans, we can establish, was written during that 3-month stint in Corinth, right? It says Erastus, the city treasurer, sends his greetings. Also in 2 Timothy 4, Erastus remained at Corinth. And so it's quite fitting then. And we actually have an archaeological discovery, a pavement slab discovered from the ancient ruins of Corinth that says Erastus wore the expense of this pavement. And so it's quite fitting then that Timothy should be traveling with Erastus, who happens to be from Corinth. It fits just in such an artless and casual, undesigned way with 1 Corinthians that it suggests that the author of Luke, whoever he was in the know about Paul's traveling activities. And that's just one example of, I mean, if you just gave me Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, the first 4 letters in the New Testament that we have, I could already give you more than 40 examples of that sort of thing.
Would you, Dr. McLatchie, also use, well, you just used the slab that was found with the inscription of Erastus's name, but would you also, so this is just a general question, would you use these other archaeological finds, from the last 100 years as corroboration that undergird the historical reliability of the New Testament documents, which undergirds the claims to the resurrection? So like the Pilate inscription, the ossuary of James or Caiaphas, and so forth and so on. Yeah,
I would. Some of them are of more evidence
as indirect evidence.
So I wouldn't. Yeah, so I wouldn't. I personally don't use like Pilate inscription, for example. The reason being that Pilate was a very, very well-known figure. So um, the things that I find to be more impressive are the hard things that the evangelists
Okay.
get right, not like big picture
Interesting.
things like who was the emperor at the time or who was the governor
Yeah.
at the time or what have you. So to give an example of that, so in Acts 27. Luke is talking about the shipwreck of St. Paul. And there's an excellent book on this topic, by the way, I recommend, which is by James Smith called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. This is also covered by Colin Hemer in his book, The Book of Acts and Sending Hellenistic History.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that one.
That's an excellent resource on extra biblical corroborations of Acts. But in terms of Paul's shipwreck in Acts 27, so of course, they're sailing from one end of the island Crete to the other, and there's a tempestuous wind called the northeaster that strikes down on the land. Now there is actually a well-confirmed wind that rides over Crete, and it happens to be strongest at this exact time around the time of Passover. So that's interesting. And the storm, it likely struck them in the Bay of Massara, and the Isle of Cauda, where they end up getting blown to, is precisely the trajectory that the northeaster ought to have carried them. And that's not the sort of information that one could have reasonably inferred without having been blown there. And the ancients found it nearly impossible to physically locate where islands were, the location of islands that far out. In fact, Ptolemy and the Encyclopedia's Pliny the Elder, they had the estimates in Luke's day, and both contradict Luke's implied location of the Isle of Cauda. But Luke's account alone actually gets it correct. And so Colin Hemer notes that it becomes increasingly difficult to think that Luke could have gotten this from some kind of contemporary reference work. So that's an example that suggests that Luke was indeed present with Paul during those travels. Another example would be in Acts 23. We read about Paul being apprehended and brought before the Jewish council. And Ananias, of course, presiding over the Jewish council, and Ananias commands those to stand by to strike Paul in the mouth. And Paul says in response, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. For in accordance with the law, you presume to judge me, and yet contrary to the law, you ordered me to be struck. And the people standing by say, you would revile God's high priest. And Paul says, oh, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it's written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, this raises an interesting question. How come Paul doesn't know who the high priest is, right? That it's really could at least tell by his garb, if nothing else. Now, if you read Josephus, we learned that Ananias, of whom this was spoken, was in truth not the high priest, right? He was sitting in judgment in that human capacity. He previously held the office. In AD 52, he got deposed. He was actually charged with sedition and sent bound to Rome to answer. And then he was later released, but not, it seems, reinstated to the office of priest. There was another guy called Jonathan who succeeded him to that office. And Jonathan got assassinated. And so between the death of Jonathan and the accession of Ishmael, son of Phabi, the next successor, there was no one occupying the office. And Paul's apprehension took place precisely in that interval. And so during that vacancy, it seems that Ananias took upon himself the discharge of the office. And so then that illuminates Paul's words. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize he was the high priest. It's a deliberate jab at Ananias.
Okay.
And so when you consider all of those clues and evidences cumulatively, and there's scores and scores of those, it suggests that Luke was indeed a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. That being the case, then Luke was in fact present with Paul in Acts 21 when Luke meets with the Jerusalem elders. And according to Luke, all the elders, including James, who was the leader of the Jerusalem church, were present. And so Luke was personally in contact with those who were purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. Of course, Luke was present with Paul for at least 2 years when Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea Maritima, following that visit to Jerusalem. And Caesarea Maritima is fairly close to Jerusalem, so he would have had ample access during that time, presumably, to those witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. So Luke was in a position to know what the witnesses were claiming. We also have reason to think that Luke is incredibly scrupulous as an historian,
right,
and that he actually is trying to get things right. And so we have reason from that to think that Luke's representation of what the apostles believed concerning the resurrection is probably accurate. And so then that adds to our case that what we have in the Gospels and Acts actually reflects Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So beginning, thank you. Very good. Again, joined by biology professor, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. So what you have given us on the resurrection notion here is what you prefer what you called, I think, the maximal data argument in contradistinction to the minimal facts argument. Is that right?
Right, exactly.
Okay. And you can, share why you don't care for the minimal facts argument if you'd like to. I want to,
Sure.
but I have one more question to go back to on science after you get done with that. I do want to say first, though, this was not by my design that you have actually, on this episode on the Bible Professor podcast, you have actually covered scientific apologetics, philosophical apologetics, and now biblical apologetics. And that's pretty much the three circles, as I call them, for apologetics. So a full-orbed Christian apologetics sampler here today. And Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, thank you. This has been, and hopefully will be a treat for many of our listeners.
Yeah, thanks. So on the minimal facts argument, so this is, of course, championed by Gary Habermas and also by Michael Licona. Michael Licona calls it the bedrock facts case. But there's a number of problems, I think. So basically, for those that aren't familiar, the minimal facts argument says that it basically tries to limit the data set that's used in making the case for the resurrection to those facts which are not only in Habermas's judgment well supported evidentially, but also have persuaded more than 90% of contemporary scholars across the theological spectrum. And one problem that I have with the minimal facts approach is that I think that many people overestimate just how much is granted by contemporary New Testament scholarship. So, for example, when someone like Habermas is pressed on the some alternative hypothesis to explain the appearances, such as some sort of mass hallucinatory experience or objective vision hypothesis or something, what minimal facts advocates will typically do is appeal to the implausibility of mass hallucinations or shared visions or something like that. But that's no longer a minimal fact because the group appearances is not recognized by a consensus of scholars. And certainly the polymodal or multisensory nature of the resurrection encounters that we read of in the Gospels and Acts are not granted by the consensus of New Testament scholars. And so I think there's a little bit of a bait and switch going on there. There's what Lydia McGrew calls an epistemic bottleneck problem, that it doesn't matter how much evidence you give for the, quote, appearances fact, even granting that the appearances fact has a probability of 1, you don't get any more probable than that. That's not sufficient to show that the apostles were rational in coming to believe that what best explains their experiences is that Jesus rose from the dead. In order to know that they were rational, we have to know something about what the experiences were like. What was their nature? And if we can't say what they're like, then it becomes impossible to adjudicate whether they were reasonable in coming to that belief. And so I think that you have to make a robust case for the strong reliability of the Gospels and Acts. And I think that we shouldn't be burdened by that. I think we should consider it a privilege to be able to point people to the evidences that show that the Gospels and Acts are indeed composed by individuals who are well informed, close up to the facts, and habitually scrupulous. I'm also not convinced that I'm certainly not convinced that one can rest the entire edifice, the case for the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 and the Pauline corpus that people like Habermas and Michael Licona tend to do. I don't think we have enough data in the Pauline corpus alone if you aren't if you aren't appealing to the Gospels and Acts. And I think Habermas also has a tendency to overplay how early you can date the creedal tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. I think that that's very plausibly pre-Pauline tradition, but I think that any statements about how early that creed dates is simply intelligent conjecture. We really don't know. And so we ought to be careful not to overstate our case.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Dr. McLatchie. I think your thoughts here today are really going to encourage folks toward Christianity, toward rethinking maybe things they were taught in high school and or college at the university, and maybe encourage other science professors or scientists out there to rethink things and think about, hey, there's another way to look at, evidences or things going on in my field of study or my field of science that maybe do point toward God. Maybe there's not. I don't need to have this bifurcation in my mind of, well, science is over here and the Bible and God are over here, sort of thing. So let me ask you, as we begin to land the plane, you have quite a online ministry. You've debated scholars of every stripe all over the world on YouTube and live events, and I've watched some of your YouTube videos. You have a ministry called Talk About Doubts. You have a website, jonathanmclatchie.com. But so share a little bit about that. But I also want you to answer this question. What of your debates, what was your most harrowing, challenging debate out there? And maybe what was your most fun one that you feel like you really got through to people and so forth?
Yeah, so my website, as you mentioned, jonathanmclatchie.com, has a lot of my essays, and I link to my videos there as well. So check that out if you would like to read some of my essays on various theological, scientific, and apologetics related topics. I also, as you mentioned, have a ministry called talkaboutdoubts.com, where basically we are a team of more than 60 scholars in different subjects who are willing to do private Zoom calls with Christians that are struggling with doubts in relation to their faith. So we have philosophers, we have New Testament scholars, Old Testament scholars, specialists in biblical Hebrew, Syro-Palestinian archaeologists. We have psychologists, physicists, biologists, even pastors on our team. And yeah, we basically, the way it works is someone comes to the website, talkaboutdoubts.com, and fills out a form, and then we distribute that to the most relevant scholar on our team, and then that scholar will get in touch with that individual and set up a private call. We also have a Discord community for past inquiries of our team, which has grown to over 100 people. Since we launched in December, we've had well over 270 inquiries at Talk About Doubts. So we've had a little over 2 a day on average. And we also have weekly Zoom hangouts for past inquirers, which alternates between an emotional support group and an online course that we teach on the evidences for Christianity. So yeah, if you're struggling with doubts about your faith, or indeed if you're an ex-Christian who wants to explore whether there's a rational way back to faith, then please reach out at talkaboutdoubts.com.
Okay, yeah, I know that's a passion and burden of yours to reach those who are thinking about deconverting, trying to get to them at that point. So talkaboutdoubts.com, and these ministry websites will be in the description below. Dr. McLatchie, please, if you would, share about your debating and your thoughts on debate. What was your most harrowing debate? What is your most often topic? I know you debate Muslims, you debate on science, you debate on the resurrection, you debate on the messianic nature of Jesus. What do you debate on the most, and what is your favorite topic?
Yeah, so I actually, to be honest, I don't consider debates to be particularly useful because there's a number of reasons for that. So, for example, I've done debates before on the resurrection of Jesus, and then it turns out that my opponent doesn't even think a robust case can be made for the historicity of Jesus in the first place. And so you have to spend a lot of time just bringing them up to speed and educating them about the evidence for Jesus, and you don't really get to touch the topic. And so the audience perceives that as a loss because you just haven't gotten to the topic, because you have to go so far back to bring your opponent up to speed on. So that's a frustration. Debates also I see as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. They are supposed to be like a starting point for further self-study. It's only an introduction to the topic where you see like a very introductory argument both for and against, whereas I find a lot of people try to educate themselves on a topic just by watching debates, which is just not a good way to do this. And they consider a lot of people consider debates to be an end in themselves rather than the beginning of one's work. It's meant to be a study tool. And also I find that with debates, rhetoric often comes to be is often more important than actual argumentative substance. So in
Yeah.
view of those and other concerns, I'm less interested in doing debates at this point. So I my focus at the moment has shifted to I talk about doubts work. But to answer your question about what I thought was the most challenging debate and maybe the most fun one, um, uh, I think probably the one where my opponent put out the best resistance was the debate that I and Max Baker Heitch from Oxford did with Apologia YouTuber and Harry Amos on the resurrection of Jesus. Really enjoyed that debate. I thought that the audience got to see kind of a good introduction to the best that both sides of that argument has to say. So I really appreciated that debate.
Okay.
I've also done debates where my opponent was completely woefully unprepared. My debate with Peter Atkins, for example, a physical chemist at Oxford University, never tired, but that was a debate which was not. It was very, very one-sided.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
You just never know what you're going to run into, right, with your opponent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. McLatchie, one final question. What do you see as the biggest moral category or just problem area for the church today?
I think anti-intellectualism in the church and
anti-intellectualism. Okay.
And anti-intellectualism, yeah, I think there shouldn't be a need for talk about doubts. This should be a pastor's role, but unfortunately, pastors aren't doing jobs in this regard.
I agree. Yeah, and maybe that's a topic we can hit on another episode if I can get more of your time one day. But okay, well, so we've been joined today by biology professor Dr. Jonathan McLatchie and his ministry talkaboutdoubts.com, jonathanmcclatchie.com. These will be in the links below. Thank you, Dr. McLatchie, for joining us today on The Bible Professor.
Thank you so much.
Okay, you've been listening to The Bible Professor.